Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this new webinar by the International Energy Agency in our program, which aims at reinforcing capacity on energy data and energy modeling. So today we will continue discussing energy modeling, looking at the building sector, and I will be joined by my colleagues, Ariane and Tim, who will share their perspective on this topic. So yesterday we had a first introductory session looking at how energy modeling work in general, what are the rationale behind creating scenario, developing some long-term plans. Today we will deep dive at one part of the energy system, which is end use sector, and try to understand what the future demand for energy will be, taking the example of building sector. So building means residential plus services. We could have looked at transport sector, we could have looked at industry, at agriculture, but it will be the same rationale and the same principles that apply to understand how this specific sector will evolve and what will be the subsequent demand for energy in the future, so that we can then understand how we can supply and meet this demand. As always, please don't be shy. Raise your hand if you have any question. Keep asking your questions on the Q&A box. We'll have one break at the middle to answer questions, and then at the end of the session of the webinar, again some questions, and my colleague Ariane will be here as well to answer them. So I'd like, as usually, to start with a mentee question. So I invite you to go to the usual website, www.mentee.com, and use a new code that we will keep for this morning session, which is 41209051. And the first question I'm asking to you is, when we look at sub-Saharan Africa and when we look at the residential sector, so households mostly, what is the largest fuel that is used in this sector after traditional biomass? We have isolated or subtracted traditional biomass because it's really weighting heavily in the energy mix in all sub-Saharan Africa. It can vary across countries, but its share is very high due to its role in providing an energy for cooking, sometimes for space heating or for water boiling. So it's really the number one fuel. But after traditional biomass, there are other fuels, other sources of energies that can be used in the residential sector. So the question is, what will be the number one after biomass? So for those who are just joining us, we are already on Mentee. You can see the code on the top end part of your screen. Okay, we're getting more answers. We have a equality between electricity and modern use of biomass. So maybe we can define traditional use of biomass would contain, for example, basic or no devices for cooking, like 3-stone fires or very basic cook stoves. It will also include the use of charcoal in a direct way for cooking. Whereas modern use of biomass is something that we can find in several developing countries, using biomass as a source of power generation. But in that case, we are more referring at biomass pellets or things that have been processed under industrial way to really optimize the moisture content, the dryness of the hood, and it can also be the use of biodigesters, which also can come at industrial or semi-industrial level. So this is more what we have in mind with the modern use of biomass, or really improved and advanced clean cook stoves. So this being said, maybe you guess that the answer is that in sub-Saharan Africa, after traditional use of biomass, the number one fuel is indeed electricity in the residential sector. And this, you could also have voted for oil somehow, because oil enables to meet several needs in the residential sector, like the need for cooking with LPG, like many people having backup generator using diesel in Nigeria. You might be aware it's really weighting a lot in the country energy mix. Solar thermal is also a technology which is very much prevalent in some regions of the world, like North Africa and the Middle East, and it has really a very strong potential in all the continents when it comes to boiling water using the sun, the solar energy with, for example, rooftop equipments. But the number one is again indeed electricity, mostly to power appliances, to power lighting services, etc. So thank you for your answers. The second question is that was today. The new question is about the future. In your opinion, which fuel do you expect to account for the majority of final demand growth, again, in the residential sector? And you have proposed the same fuels as just before. I give you a bit more time. So thank you for your answers. So you are rating electricity very high, then gas also at a medium level, and then would come modern use of biomass, oil. So again, we don't know what the future would look like. We can make projections, we can build scenarios. So maybe that question would be qualified, whether we are under a scenario which would take into account the stated policies, the announced targets by the government, or if it would take a normative approach where we know we want to reach certain level of GDP plus limitation of CO2 emissions plus universal access to clean cooking and electricity. So we would not have the same results, and that will be presented to you at a global level. But indeed, in all our scenario, electricity is really gaining a rising share to meet to meet many of the energy services needs in the residential sector. So I'm moving back to the presentation to present you what will be discussed today. So again, we'll discuss about the building sector, so residential and services, but please keep in mind that what we'll discuss can really apply to the transport sector, can apply to industry, to agriculture. It is more to illustrate the dynamic. And also we've chosen the building because we think it's a very important sector in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. We already discussed the increase in cooling needs and how this would impact the entire energy systems for power, but also beyond in Africa. We also mentioned access to clean cooking, which is a key target for governments and would have a significant implications on the fuels to be provided and the equipments to be used in the building sector. So this is why we picked up building, and we will discuss during the first presentation about activity, structure, performances in this sector, as well as drivers. And in the second part, we will move more from how to take all the steps to go from the need for an energy service, like I want some light in my house, I want appliances to be on, to the final energy demand, taking all the steps that are required. So now I will give the floor to my colleagues Ariane and Tim, who will present that to you into more details.
On this slide, you have the general schematic overview of the world energy model. And in this presentation, we will focus on the building sector, which includes the services and residential sector, which are encircled in red on the slide. You can also see the main driver of the related energy service demand. When looking at this overview, we should not forget that an important additional feedback needs to be considered: the impact that electricity and heat prices and fossil fuel prices have on end-use demand in general, and in this particular case, on the energy demand in the building sector. When working on the sector, the first step before doing any modeling is to analyze what do people want. What they want and use are called energy services. In the building sector, it can be space heating, cooling, lighting, cooking, etc. To meet service demand, we need energy, and this energy is consumed by different technologies. In the building sector, it can be air conditioners, light bulbs, radiators, etc. And for each equipment, we also have its associated efficiency. We therefore can distinguish three areas: activity, structure, and performance. The activity is linked to the energy services. The structure is linked to the type of equipment present in the building sector, and the performance is linked to the efficiencies of the different technologies. And all of this needs to be depicted in the model. If we look in more details at the structure of the building model, we see that we have different parts that make up the model. The first part includes all the inputs that are needed to do the modeling: historical data regarding energy balances, building stock, equipment sales, and also socioeconomic data like population, electrification rate, or GDP. And we also do some assumptions for the evolution of some of these data, so for instance, population. Some of these inputs will be used to compute energy service demand drivers, like household occupancy, floor area, or appliance ownership. Of course, these drivers will differ for each subsector. Indeed, the drivers are then used to determine the future useful energy demand, or the activity, as mentioned earlier. So for instance, for space heating, we can use the flow area as one of the drivers. In addition to that, we also need a number of historical and future technology data that describe the structure and performance of our system. These data include the efficiencies, the lifetime, the market share of the different technologies. We can then compute for each end use what technologies will meet the service demand, and we will finally estimate the energy demand by subsector and by fuel, as well as the investments and CO2 emissions. If we look in more details at the structure of a building model, we see that we have different parts that make up the model. The first part includes all the inputs that are needed to do the modeling. As we've just seen, we need a lot of data inputs, as data are essential for energy models. Accurate balances are the basis for all modeling work, as we have seen and mentioned in the previous webinars on energy statistics. That's why it's important to build a data repository to organize all the data that you will use for your modeling. As mentioned, the data include energy balances, technologies data with efficiencies, costs, but also policy data that will impact the evolution of this sector. We will explore which are the most important ones in the next slides. As mentioned earlier, one important step of the modeling process is to define energy demand drivers, as they play a key role in describing energy consumption patterns in energy models. Thus, it's crucial to define the best proxy to describe past trends and possible future ones. Before looking in detail at drivers and different methodologies to estimate them, you can see here the general structure for modeling end-use sectors. So first, with the drivers and econometric analysis, we estimate the evolution of the energy service demand, or useful energy. Then, to meet the service demand, we allocate different technologies. And in the case of the world energy model, we use a cost-based approach to do this. Then, with the efficiencies of the different technologies, we can compute the final energy demand. If we go back to the drivers, we will look over the next slides at possible methodologies to identify the best proxy for each subsector. The projections of activity variables can be based on regression with respect to GDP or electrification, but we can also use different types of curves, like the S-curve. And as mentioned earlier, this requires to use different data that can come from the IMF or other national reports.
You've now been introduced to the importance of buildings energy demand modelling and the strong role of bottom-up modelling of energy demand for each end use within the building sector. And then following this, the processes and structure used in the modelling of buildings energy demand in the International Energy Agency. And now I'd like to focus in on one of the most important steps of our modelling process, and that is the definition of the best proxy to then describe the activity variable that can help us understand how service demand evolves for each type of building end use. So again, the proxy is the link that helps us to go from socioeconomic information to activity variables and then to services demand. Now, why do we need this link? Well, firstly, activity variables. We might have this information available for certain countries in the historical period, but we don't have it available for all countries over all of the time series, and we definitely don't have this information available for the projections. So therefore, it's up to us to take the information that we do have, and that is socio-economic information, and to use this information and these assumptions for the future to calculate our own activity variables. Once we've calculated these activity variables, we can use them in our projections to understand how service demand evolves, and then based on what technologies we choose, how energy demand evolves in our projections. Now, there are several types of activity variables that are of interest to us. Certainly in the building sector, one of the most important activity variables is household occupancy. So this is how many people live in each household on average. Now, household occupancy can help us to understand energy demand for end uses such as cooking or water heating, for example. Now, because we do not have information on household occupancy into the future, it's up to us to try and define a relationship between a variable that we do have information in the future and this household occupancy variable. So here we've chosen to plot values of household income against household occupancy. So we've taken all the data on household occupancy that we do have for historical periods for different countries, and we've put them on this chart against the GNI per capita, which is in itself an indicator of household income or of personal income. And what we can see is we have an inverse curve that's being drawn here. So that means that as we increase the average income per capita or per household, then we are decreasing the number of people per household. So here we're seeing a strong relationship between GNI per capita, so gross national income per capita, and a decreasing number of people per household. So we have on the right an inverse curve equation that can be used to define this relationship, and then can be very interesting for us and is a key step in our modeling to be able to say in the future, if from our external assumptions, which for us come from organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and our own assessment and projections of economic growth and population, we then use these assumptions on economic variables to understand via this equation how household occupancy evolves in time. So that's just one example of this process of identifying a proxy that has a good relationship with the variable that interests us, and using this proxy to describe the activity variable. So here, household occupancy. Now, another example of a relationship of interest to us in the buildings energy demand modeling area is ownership variables. And so how does the ownership of a given appliance, such as a refrigerator in this example, evolve in time based on another variable? So here we've plotted ownership of refrigerators for all the countries for which we have data and over all the years for which we have data. And we've plotted that against here where we have a discriminant criterion, but we can very easily say that we can plot this against GNI per capita or even GDP per capita. So the most important variable to have on the x-axis is income in this case. And if we build this chart and fill out the data, we can very clearly see that there is an S-curve relationship between refrigeration ownership, so the average number of refrigerators per household, and the average income. And so that means that with time, as income increases, then we get to a point where the number of refrigerators on average per household starts to really increase. And then as we get to a point where households are increasingly rich, then the growth in refrigerator ownership slows down. Because once we get to a point where we already have at least one refrigerator on average per household, then obviously there's less need to increase and to continue to purchase additional refrigerators. So there is a saturation point, and that's why S-curves are so important, because they show us at the start that we might not have enough income even to think about buying a refrigerator, but at a certain point we start to cross that threshold and a refrigerator becomes a desirable and useful purchase and use of income. So we see that growth, that increase in the rate of growth of the S-curve, and then it flattens out as we start to saturate. So the S-curve is a very important indicator for understanding the relationship between many economic variables and the activity variables that interest us for buildings energy demand modeling. And I'll get to a description of the discriminant criterion and how we can draw upon several economic variables to influence and describe this curve in just a minute. But firstly, I would like to go through an example of air conditioning ownership. So here we've done the same thing as in the previous figure. We've plotted on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, the ownership, the average ownership of air conditioners, and on the x-axis, the income, the average income per capita. So we've used all the data points that we have in our database, and we can see that it's a big cloud of points without a very strong relationship. So here it's difficult to imagine an S-curve describing the evolution of air conditioner ownership with income. But when we bring an additional piece of information to the picture, we start to see much clearer relationships. So now we start to plot data points, so air conditioner ownership and income, depending on the need for cooling in that region. So here the need for cooling is described in terms of annual cooling degree days. So a cooling degree day is a variable that can be calculated based on the threshold temperature in a given country and the average daily temperatures within that country. So here we can clearly see that for countries in darkest red, so the countries with the greatest cooling demand need, there is a relatively strong view of an S-curve that evolves in time. So we can see that as in those countries incomes start to increase, the rate of air conditioner ownership rapidly increases and moves towards 1, so an average of 1 air conditioner per household. However, if we look at countries in blue, so with very low cooling needs, then we can see that even when incomes, average per capita incomes increase to very high levels, the air conditioner ownership stays quite low, because obviously these households, despite their high incomes, are prioritizing purchases in other needs because their cooling needs are not very high and not very pressing. So the message here is that sometimes we might have just the economic variable, so GDP per capita, and some information on ownership, but that's not enough to define a clear trend and a clear curve that can be useful for us. So sometimes we need to bring additional data to the table to help us understand the evolution and the relationship between the economic variable and the activity variable that interests us. Now, before going on, I'd just like to summarize some of the key end uses that we model in a bottom-up fashion in our buildings energy demand modeling, and the activity variables that we use to describe the energy service demand for that end use. And then further on, the proxy that we use, so the economic variable that is a key variable for us to help to understand the relationship between evolving economic conditions and the activity variable. And then finally on the right, the type of curve and the type of equation that we use to connect the proxy with the activity variable. So firstly, with cooking, the first curve that we saw was an inverse curve. And so for cooking, we use people per household to help us understand the evolution of service demand. So people per household is our activity variable. And as with all end uses in buildings, we're using GNI per capita, GDP per capita as well, as the most important proxy to help us describe the evolution of the activity variable. So we take our projection of GNI per capita that comes from other assumptions. So again, it might be World Bank, IMF. For population, it might be the United Nations. And then we use this variable via the curve, so the inverse curve in this case for cooking, to describe people per household and understand the evolution of people per household in time. For lighting, we use an S-curve because the activity variable is floor space per household. And with an S-curve, that describes the fact that as households become more rich, so does the floor space of those households increase, and then we get to a point where there's saturation, and so the S-curve starts to flatten out. For water heating, it's again a question of describing energy service demand by the number of people that live in the household, because if we think that each person in the household may take 1 shower per day, therefore the energy demand need for water heating is dependent on the number of people in the household. So here, again, we're using an inverse curve, the same as for cooking. But then if we look at air conditioning, so cooling and appliances, then it's a question of ownership. How many air conditioners or how many refrigerators, televisions are owned on average by the household? And then how does this ownership evolve based on increasing income? So again, an S-curve, rapidly increasing at a certain point and then starting to slow down as ownership saturates. Now, just a note here on cooling, we could also say that floor space per household is an important variable, because if we're trying to cool a much larger household with 1 air conditioner, then we're going to be having a higher energy service demand. So we can certainly look at both variables, firstly the ownership rate, and then also if we have an increasing number of meters squared per household, that will also increase the floor space, the energy service demand, sorry. So in cases like this, we can look at having 2 activity variables that both combined can help us to understand the evolution of energy service demand. Now, to move on, I wanted to come back to the fact that sometimes we want to bring in additional variables to help us describe the trends. So if we look on the left-hand figure, the x-axis here is just GNI per capita. So it's an income proxy, essentially. So we're taking our income variable and we're using this to describe the number of units per household. But we can see that the curve is quite cramped. It's really not an easily defined S-curve. And that's because in the first, let's say, $5,000 of GNI per capita, there's a huge amount of people that suddenly buy refrigerators. And it's all happening very rapidly, and perhaps economic variables such as GNI per capita are not the perfect variable to understand what's happening in this first part of the curve. But now if we turn to the right-hand side figure, then we can we use here a discriminant criterion. So this is basically saying it's a variable without a unit, which is just an indicator that combines several proxies. So it's combining GNI per capita, so it's taking the economic variable, but we're also bringing in information on the electrification rate within the country and the urbanization rate. Because when we start plotting this data, we clearly see that not only does the economic variable influence ownership, but so does electrification rate and urbanization. Because obviously we're not going to buy a refrigerator if we do not have access to electricity. So despite the fact that we might have an income, if without electricity, there's no point buying a refrigerator. So this is, it seems evident, but obviously it becomes very important when we start translating it into these curves, and we can see this flat period at the beginning for those that still don't have access to electricity, despite the fact that they might have an income. And likewise, the data shows that with higher levels of urbanization, we also have higher levels of refrigerator ownership. And so we bring in these 3 different variables that describe so an energy access trend, an economic trend, and a geographical trend, and bring that information together to build this discriminant criterion, which then helps us to get a much more clearly defined S-curve, which is then more useful in understanding in the future with a given a value for energy access, for income, and for urbanization, what might we expect in terms of ownership. So this is multivariate analysis and multivariate regression, as opposed to the earlier examples which were shown, which were using a single variable, so GDP per capita in those instances. Okay, now let's run through the principles of multivariate analysis for using many or several economic variables, population variables, or other interesting variables for which we have information to describe the evolution of activity variables. So the first point here is to look at the data that we do have. So taking the data we have on, say, if we're interested in refrigeration ownership, looking at the available data on refrigeration ownership, selecting a set of these data points which seem like a good, clean trend, and then trying to match these data points with available variable data on, say, GNI per capita, GNI GNI absolute values, electrification rates, weather data perhaps, or any other variables that might be available. And then what we can do is plot all these variables together on a chart. And so, for instance, we'll have our variables on the y-axis on refrigeration ownership, and then we'll be plotting that on the x-axis against lots of different variables again and again to try and understand, is there a relationship between that variable refrigeration ownership and the variable that we're putting on the x-axis. And so what we can do, what we achieve by doing this, is we identify the most important variables that seem to have some sort of relationship between this variable and refrigeration ownership. And then we can partition the data into similarities, or based on what the data is actually describing. So, for instance, if I take GDP per capita or GNI per capita, they're very similar data points. And so within this multivariate process, there's no point having data points that overlap and describe very similar trends. So even though both GNI per capita and GDP per capita are very useful variables that can both be used to describe the evolution of my activity variable, I'm not going to put them both into this multivariate analysis because they are describing the same things. However, if we look at a variable such as electricity access, then that is removed from GDP per capita and describing a different set of trends, and therefore we would put that in another class, and it would be very useful then to have variables from different classes, for instance 2 or 3 variables from 2 or 3 different classes, and bring these together to then feed into to establish the best combination of these descriptive variables that can be used to describe our activity variable. So once we have the 3 or the 2 variables that we've chosen, then we want to use a certain type of multivariate regression to understand what the best combination of these variables is to best describe this activity variable trend. So for us, we use canonical variate analysis. And so that's something that that you can look up and try and understand the processes involved, or there's many other multivariate regression techniques that can be used to combine several variables to deliver one discriminant criteria, so one variable that combines all this information and then can be used for us to plot and understand the evolution of the activity variable. So that's then step 5. Once we have this relationship defined, then we can use our projections of, say, electricity access rates, of urbanization, of GDP per capita, feed all this information in, calculate our discriminant criteria, then take the discriminant criteria, put it into our curve equation, so our S-curve equation in this case, and then that will give us a forecast of the ownership of the activity variable. Now, the final point I want to make before I pass on again here is what we do with tracking data and how do we project the variables that interest us when we do not have the available historical data. So just take a step back. The first thing we do is we bring all the data that we do have together for all the countries that interest us. And then what we'll do, we'll divide the countries into different classes based on the type of, I guess, the category of the country. And so, for instance, we would bring countries together that have similar economic contexts, that have similar climatic and population growth contexts. So here on the left, we can see we've put countries, so country A, B, and C into different classes. And so we have several different classes for countries across the world. But for instance, if you're looking just at the African region, it might be pertinent just to have one class and to not bother about defining different classes. Now, once we've done that classification by class, then we need to look at the data availability for each country within each class. So for instance, if we take the example of country A, then country A is a country that is well informed in terms of data. So we have historical data available for many years for the activity variable that interests us. So it could be household occupancy, it could be refrigeration ownership rates, it could be floor area per average household. So here we have the information we need historically to be able to build the curve, build a robust equation that then can be used for the projections. However, for many countries, this unfortunately isn't the case. We do not have this data available. So for many countries, we find ourselves in the position of country B. So that means we're poorly informed. We might only have a couple of data points. So there might be a data point from a survey that's taken place only once, or maybe 5 years ago and 10 years before that. And so that means that we don't have sufficient data available to build a robust and reliable curve, so an S-curve equation, for example, and then to be able to use this S-curve equation to project activity variables into the future. And so what we do in this case is we use the curve that was described by all the countries for which we do have data. So we take the average curve of all the countries in class 3. So for instance, if we put all the data for ownership of refrigerators for countries in class 3 together in one figure, and then we use that to describe, to build an S-curve, and we have the equation for that S-curve, we can then use that S-curve equation for all countries that find themselves in the position of country B. But we shouldn't forget that for country B, we do have 1 or 2 data points. So what we'll do is we'll then shift the curve up or down to make sure that the curve is running through the most recent historical data point that we have available. So that's a way of ensuring that for us, we can use these curves to describe the trends for the 1 or 2 data points we do have, and to backfill the missing historical data, as well as understanding how these activity variables will evolve in the future. The final situation is the situation of country C. So this is a country for which we have no data at all for activity variables for the end use that interests us. So in this case, we have no other options. All we can do is take the average curve of class 3, so the average of all the countries within this class. And so that means country C will just be described by the average throughout, because we don't have any data points to be able to shift and run through those data points. And so we go straight through to the projections of the activity variables using obviously the economic variables that are specific to country C, but using the S-curve or the inverse curve equation, that is the average of all the countries in class 3. So this is a very important point on how to find the data, and then what to do with the data, and what to do, very importantly, when we don't have the data, all the data that we need to build these curves, and therefore to project the activity variables. And just a point to note on data, so obviously there's many different sources available for countries across the world, but in many African countries it can be quite difficult to find this sort of data. So at the International Energy Agency, we've often looked to surveys such as the surveys conducted by USAID, and we can find these surveys online, the DHS surveys, and often there is information within those surveys that can be used to help us in this modeling process. Alternatively, there can be specific literature on a specific country based on surveys conducted within that country, or based on academic work. But basically, the first step certainly is to look for the data that does exist for the end users that interest us most, and to contact or reach out to as many people as you can to try and get the best data and ensure that you start with the strongest foundation.
Okay, so now we'll go to a few questions. So you have the ability to ask any question on what was presented using the Q&A functionality, or directly raising your hand. While you may ask your question, I can just share a few more information specific to the building sector and to Ghana. So yesterday, as you may remember, we discussed the IEA Ghana energy outlook projections when looking at total primary energy demand and GDP under our two main scenario, stated policies taking into account the announced policies, and the Africa case, which instead is drawing a pathway if we want to reach universal access to electricity and clean cooking, if we want to reach GDP growth as per the aspiration of the continent under the Africa Union Agenda 2063, and last, limiting also pollution and CO2 emissions. So here you could see how the different mix of energy was evolving. What does that mean for the building sector? So here you can see all the end use sectors. So productive use, or let's say industry, transport, and residential. So you have on the left side the consumption of fossil fuels, and on the right side consumption of electricity. And you can see that the green part, which is residential, is expected to grow in all scenarios. More specifically, electricity would increase as we expect millions of additional appliances and cooling systems in the country, but we also expect other developments of demand in the industry, right? For example, with bauxite mining, steel, aluminium industries demanding more electricity. You would also see an increase in the transport sector with more passenger to be transported, and an increase in the number of 2 or 3 wheelers in Ghana. What might be interesting to look at here is the differences um, between the steps scenario and the Africa case. In the two cases, you would see that we have isolated the upward trends. So what is creating an increase in the fossil fuel consumption, and the downward trends, what is created a decrease in this energy consumption. And what you can see is that it relates to our hypothesis in building this scenario. And the Africa case includes assumptions on higher GDP and access, which leads to an increase in fossil fuel and electricity consumption. But in the Africa case, we also took into consideration more efficient appliances, more efficient cars, more efficient industry equipments. So this would contribute to decreasing or limiting the growth of the energy, both fossil fuel and electricity. So this is the high-level view. If we look more specifically at one energy service which is needed at the residential level, it's cooking. And you can see that according to our historical data and data collected by WHO, on the left part, you would see the fuels and technologies used for cooking in Ghana in the year 2018. So we have a significant share of the population still relying on charcoal, but others relying on other type of solid biomass um, direct wood stick collected or purchased. And there is 1/4 of the population relying on LPG, presumably more in the urban centers or peri-urban areas. This is the picture today. What does the future could look like? Again, we take a scenario approach, stated policy scenario. We expect we expect population growth, and we expect the share of each fuels to change with a higher share of LPG, also other clean sources that can be electricity, that can be the use of biogas. So this would entail a reduction of the share of the use of charcoal and solid biomass used in traditional way, while we would expect improved cook stoves to take a bigger share of the cooking mix. In the Africa case, our target is universal access, so we only want clean solutions. And here we can see that it's divided amongst LPG and improved coke stoves plus other clean solution. Traditionally, LPG seem more suitable for urban and peri-urban areas because we need those strong infrastructure, distribution, refilling networks, whereas for rural areas where population might be less concentrated and with more isolated groups of population, improved cook stoves would be more fitted to provide a clean solution. So these were some Ghana specific projections based on our book. I see there is a question. What is the basis of the Africa targets in 2030? I'm not sure if you could specify what you mean by Africa target and basis, but in the meantime, I can maybe elaborate on the Africa case. So this is a scenario we have defined, taking some assumptions, and those assumptions are: number one, in terms of socioeconomic drivers and GDP input, we want to take into account the aspirations that the continent has taken for itself under the Africa Union 2063 agenda. So this entails a certain level of GDP growth, and with inclusivity, so meaning that we would expect industry to develop at a certain level, that we would expect agriculture to increase at a certain level. So we have taken assumptions based on, I think, added value per sector, but my colleagues could confirm that. But these were some input hypotheses, and we have translated that into different energy needs. If industry grow, depending on the type of energy, this would entail more consumption of gas, electricity, oil products, etc., etc. So this was number one. Number two hypothesis is universal access to both electricity and clean cooking. So looking at how many people would there be in the continent in 2030, and we want all those people, all households, to have access to a minimum level of service of electricity. It can be through the grid, it can be through mini grids or solar home systems, and we want those households to cook with clean fuels and equipment. And last, we also included climate and environmental consideration, limiting air pollution and emissions. Okay, so thanks for the clarification. I hope this answers your question, and happy to provide more. Maybe as you ask more questions, I can again share with you very briefly. So I just extracted those information from the IEA Africa Energy Outlook report. It dates back to 2019, but it's still, I think, one of the most advanced modeling exercise done for the continent. It's free and available on our website. And we under this book, we of course describe today's or 2019's situation and potential outlooks under those two scenarios, stated policies and Africa case. And we have some modeling done at the regional level plus at the country level, you can see a map with all the countries we have individually looked at, and Ghana is one of them. So we have several information findings on the potential future electricity mix, potential pathway for reaching universal access to electricity based on geospatial analysis. And you can compare these to other countries, to other results. So that's an interesting resource, and we'll continue discussing it over the course of this training. Okay, I don't see more questions, so again, feel free to ask any. In the meantime, I suggest that I ask questions to you, and we come back to the mentee polling website. So you shall be able to see now a new question, which is more practical and more about how to concretely make some calculation to estimate future energy demand and to process different data you may have. So now we're looking at the cooling needs in the residential or building sector. And assuming that you know the energy consumption of one AC unit, to you, what's the most important parameter to estimate total demand stemming from cooling needs in the residential sector? Is it about looking at the floor space in the country, the average size of the houses or of the apartments people live in? Is it the number of households in the country? Is it the number of units of air conditioner per household? Okay, so interesting. You're answering all of those parameters, and actually, there is no bad answer for sure, because all those parameters will be taken into consideration in our calculation. What we will see is that it's not used at the same stage of the reasoning. Floor space can be a very good activity variable to understand how the need for cooling will evolve. So assuming that due to the economic development of the country and increase of middle class and maybe availability of more buildings, we could expect households to live in bigger apartments or bigger houses, and this would have consequences for their need for cooling the place they live in. Then number of units per household, that we can track historical data. We can look at how this has evolved over time in similar countries and try to deduct what should be the future, what is likely to be the future level of equipments per household, and then multiplying that by the number of households, we will be able to deduct how many air conditioner will there be in the country. And then based on the level of energy consumption, of efficiency of each device, we will be able to estimate what the demand for electricity to meet those cooling services will be in the country. We'll come back to that with the Excel exercise. So thanks for your answers, all very good. So now looking at another need at the household or residential level, which is getting hot water. So if we know the energy consumption of a water heater in a house, to you, what's the most important parameter to estimate total demand? As previously several parameters can enter into the calculation, but who would you vote for, or which would you vote for and which would you not vote for? Okay, so I don't see any votes so far for floor space, because indeed, according to econometric analysis we have conducted so far on other countries or on historical data, we don't see this variable impacting the level of service needs for hot water, regardless of if you live in a very big apartment or in a very small one. The main parameter that will impact the quantity of hot water you want is the number of people, the dwelling occupancy. And then, as we discussed, a number of households will enable to move from your calculation at a household level to a number at the country level. So thank you very much for your answer. I propose we go to the second part of the presentation with Tim and Ariane, entering again more into the details of how to make such calculation to go from I expect or I want to estimate how much cooling services will be required by households, how much lighting services will be required by the services and the companies or the offices in my building sector, to what that will mean for final energy demand.
Once we have determined past and projected activity variables and service demand intensity, the total energy service demand, or useful energy, can be computed. For this, we can rely on end-use intensity, which is derived from our projections of activity drivers, as well as other data coming from our database, like the historic energy demand by fuel and end users, historic and projected temperatures. So we usually use heating degree days and cooling degree days, or historical technology market share and efficiency. For instance, with all this information, we can compute the energy intensity per square meter for space heating. Once obtained the total projected service demand, we can now reflect on which technologies will meet the demand. So for each year of the projection, we can compute the total energy service demand that needs to be satisfied by new equipment, by accounting for new incremental demand and considering the retirement of existing technologies. So of course, in later years of the projection, we also have to take into account the retirement of technologies that were added by our model. So how do we do this? For this, we need to have a detailed stock accounting. So with the historical market shares and efficiencies, we can compute the stock of existing technologies. And with the lifetime, we can determine the remaining stock for each year of our projection. And finally, we can compute the service demand to be met with new sales. So the sales of new equipment need therefore to replace previous equipment and to meet new demand for energy services. So you can see that the lifetime of equipment and its age distribution can play an important role in the capability of the system to renew the overall technology stock. In countries with burgeoning energy demand, such as in developing countries, the share of replacing old infrastructure and technologies is more limited, while its weight is more important in advanced economies. Now we have to determine which technologies will meet the service demand. The technology and fuel choice depends on a variety of elements, and first of all on the available technologies for each subsector in each market considered. That's why we have an important database with all technologies available in each subsector. So for instance, you can look at the cooling subsector and you can see the different types of air conditioner that are in the model. The choice of technology depends on various parameters. The available potential of renewable resources can play a very important role, as well as several energy policies such as energy efficiency standards. In the world energy model, we rely mainly on a cost-based approach to determine which technologies will be installed. For this, we need to compute the cost associated to each technology, which includes the investment cost as well as the operation cost. For instance, for an air conditioner, we must take into account the price of this AC, but also the price of electricity that will be consumed by this technology. In our model, we assume that the technology share will be proportional to 1 divided by the specific cost of this technology. This least cost approach is often the most used criterion to select the technologies, but it's also important to consider boundaries to reflect market failures, behavioral patterns, and energy policies. For instance, we can set a minimum target for heat pump to be installed if we consider that energy policies are pushing the development. Here you have an example of the projections we made for various lighting technologies. On the left, you have the evolution of efficiencies, and on the right, the evolution of the market share of the LED. So with this information, we'll be able to compute the main outputs of the model. So you can see that estimates of historical efficiencies and performances of equipment and possible future evolutions are key parameters to make reliable estimates. That's why technology partnership, sharing information, and continuous interaction with the energy industry are really crucial elements to achieve it. As said before, once the technology choice is determined for each subsector for each projection year, together with the market share, efficiency, and fuel of use, the final energy demand can be computed, as well as the related CO2 emissions and the investments that are needed for new equipment additions.
In the last part of this building's energy demand modelling session, I would like to provide several examples of the results of our modelling, specifically the results of our modelling applied to the Africa context, and use these results to reinforce the importance of efficiency gains and understanding the impact. So these are some of the results that we can then communicate to policymakers to reinforce steps and putting in place policies to achieve energy objectives. We've taken an example from the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook Special Report on Africa, published in 2019. So looking at electricity demand from household appliances in the year 2040 under 2 different scenarios. Now, if we look at the left part of the figure, we can see that under a scenario where the current and announced policies are enacted and economic growth follows an expected trajectory as announced by the International Monetary Fund, then we could see electricity demand across Africa for these uses, for residential uses, increasing to around 350 or close to 400 terawatt hours. However, if we pass to a scenario where economic growth in Africa is much more rapid. So economic growth is in line with the expectations for African countries, and we also have energy access, so universal access to electricity and to clean cooking, which is achieved by 2030, so in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Then we see a much more rapid growth in energy service demand. So obviously, if we come back to the activity variable story and the bottom-up modeling process, then higher economic activity means higher average household incomes. This then translates to greater floor area on average per household, much higher household ownership of appliances such as refrigerators, televisions, washing machines, and higher household ownership of cooling equipment such as air conditioners. So if we just added to the system the same equipment that was being used in the step scenario, then we would have a huge increase in electricity demand. So going from around 350 terawatt hours to over 1,000 terawatt hours. So this obviously has very important implications for power systems and for the costs needed to increase generation capacity, increase transmission capacity, and then for energy bills, electricity bills for consumers. But what we want to show here is that by improving the efficiency of the appliances that are added, we can drastically reduce the impact of all these additional appliances. So that means that we can have a big increase in demand for energy services, and so in quality. We can see that the very important differences, the ownership variables for different types of appliances averaged across Africa. So we can see that we have significant growth already in the steppes, especially in appliances such as televisions and refrigerators, but also in air conditioners, although they do remain at a much lower base. However, if we look at the Africa case, then this growth in ownership really does explode. So obviously this is important. It's people getting access to services, but via the modeling, we understand that as we put in place more efficient technologies, so thanks to policies, then we can limit the impact on energy systems of this increase in energy demand, energy service demand. So to be able to do this sort of analysis, we also need to have the modeling in place, but we need to understand what policies are in place today and what are the efficiencies of existing equipment and equipment being sold. For instance, we'll need to know how efficient are the air conditioners being sold today and what policies are in place that would impact the efficiency of these air conditioners. So that provides us with a baseline, and we can also look at how the policies and the policy change over the last years has impacted the energy intensity of these end users. So here is just an example where both heating and cooling policies have been tracked, and we can look at the building stock and the useful energy demand in terms of understanding which part of that energy demand is covered by policies or not covered by policies. And then based on that, we can understand how stringent is the average coverage across the building stock. And so what we want to see is that the stringency improvement really brings down the energy intensity of meeting demand for services such as cooling and heating. And if we take the example of water heating, then here we're looking at the evolution of energy demand in 3 different scenarios. So the first scenario, the RTS, is a scenario similar to STEP. So here we're just looking at the policies that are in place and the policies that have been announced, whereas the 2 scenarios to the right are more ambitious scenarios that meet climate objectives, so a 2-degree scenario and a below 2-degree scenario. So what we see here is just pure outputs of our model when we impose the constraints of saying we need to reduce emissions in line with a certain scenario, so 2 degrees or beyond 2 degrees. Then that means we need to see a big change in the fuel mix. And so this is obviously bottom up. It's coming from us saying we need to allocate a renewable technology as opposed to a fossil fuel fired technology. And these are the evolutions of the energy mix that then result. So it's these kind of results that can provide a visual communication of what the modeling is doing and then help us to bring together key messages and key numbers to communicate to the policymakers who can then act on the information coming from the model. And one final slide here is very specific to Africa and specific to cooling, to again underline the importance of increasing efficiency. So Africa's cooling needs, as many of us know, are much higher than most other places in the rest of the world. Many locations across Africa have cooling needs that are an order of magnitude higher than in countries such as France or Italy. And these cooling needs also dwarf major cooling demand centers of China and the United States. And we see that almost 700 million Africans today live in areas where the average daily temperature exceeds 25 degrees. And average temperatures are often 1 to 2 degrees higher again in cities. And as Africa's population increasingly urbanizes, cooling needs will further grow. By 2040, the number of Africans living in hot areas approaches 1.2 billion people. As populations expand, especially in cities, and average temperatures increase with climate change. High cooling needs today and higher cooling needs tomorrow contrast with some of the lowest levels of air conditioner ownership in any region. Averaging today only 6 units, so 6 air conditioners on average per 100 households. Now, obviously, wealthier countries across the continent, such as Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, have higher ownership rates that can be up to 3 times the average of the African continent itself, while less affluent countries with often much higher cooling needs have ownership levels that are only half the African average or less. So as a consequence of this low average ownership of cooling needs, electricity demand for cooling today is very, very low in Africa. But the potential for future growth is strong. Ownership of cooling devices sees an important increase in our Africa case in response to these higher average incomes I described earlier and rates of access to electricity. So we reach in 2040 an average of 25 units per 100 households, but this is still well below the global average today. Ownership of fans increases further, but fans obviously have a lesser impact on electricity demand. So if we focus on electricity demand from air conditioners, then we can see that electricity demand in the residential sector across Africa for this end use could grow to well over 200 terawatt hours by 2040. So that is just a huge increase in demand that would have major implications for power systems, especially because of the fact that air conditioning electricity demand is often concentrated in certain hours of the day, so difficult to manage. But the importance here is to use the building energy demand modeling to understand that if we change the efficiency of these air conditioners, then we have the potential to cut this future growth in half. So we can reduce costs for the power system, reduce costs for the consumer, and reduce emissions. So here, this is again the messaging using the model to understand if we change certain variables, such as putting in place a policy which improves air conditioner efficiency, what are the results that we could expect?
Okay, so we come to the last part of our session today. We will start with looking at the exercise. Again, any question you have on what has just been presented by Tim and Ariane, please feel free to raise your hand or ask using the Q&A box. Ariane will join us in a second to take some questions you might have as well. So really, I invite you to make the most of her time, because she's really super expert and specialized into looking at future energy demand from the building sector. So she might have some interesting insights. So looking at the small exercise we sent you, I would like to share again the handbook you have received, which contains all the exercises we discussed, and there is one on modeling energy demand from the building sector. So I'll be zooming a bit on this part and also shifting to the Excel sheet itself. So here the situation is we imagine that the Ministry of Energy wants to anticipate future electricity demand from buildings and to develop some relevant energy efficiencies policies related to one energy need, which is cooling. And since we are doing this as a short exercise, we have made many simplification, but of course we could enrich and look at get a broader picture. But what you receive is made of a table with historical data, because we can't look at the future if we don't know where we come from. Some projections that would rely on other institutions, like how the GDP is expected to evolve. This might come from the Ministry of Finance or from international institutions like IMF. How population is to evolve in the future. So this could be I'm not sure, a country like Ethiopia, maybe just looking at the number of population. And then we have historical data on the number of households, the number of AC units in the country. This could come from customs, who know how many products were imported, or from surveys. Then we have also information more related to the power sector on service demand intensity and electricity demand at the country level. And we will really take the steps that Ariane took you through, looking at the drivers of demand to project how this could evolve, then looking at the future services required, the different technologies that can provide some cooling. So there could be fans, AC units, many different things. And from that, we'll evaluate the final energy demand. Again, we have made many simplification that you will find here. We have also additionally to what is presented here, we could dig much more into how cooling needs can be met. Of course, there are more technologies, and what we discuss here with only AC units. There could be fans, there could be also other devices. We shall not neither underestimate the impact of the building itself, and there are some building codes that enable to reduce the temperature of the building, and then that reduce the need for using cooling devices. Very simple things like just painting in white rather than in dark have a strong impact on reducing the indoor temperature. Then our projection could also take into account evolution of the weather to reflect how the external temperature would impact and would determine the need for also the willingness of households to get more cooling, etc., etc. We can always enrich. It's a question of what data are available. What question do you want to answer, and do you want to take a week digging into something complex, or just a few hours doing something simplified, etc. But here, the first step was to analyze our historical data, and I'm moving to the Excel file. Okay, I hope you can see. And again, we'll share all the solutions. I will go very quickly, not enter into the formula, etc., so that we can move to questions earlier. But the first question was to calculate GDP per capita in kilo USD rather than in USD, just dividing by 1,000, calculating the number of units of AC units per household, given that we had the number, sorry, it was for historical, looking at the number of AC units in the country and the number of households, we could deduct number of AC units per household. Then it came to looking at our variable to estimate how the need for cooling will evolve. And the first thing we wanted to look at was how the number of people per household, so the dwelling occupancy, will evolve. We have it. For historical data, because we know total population and number of households. And for the future, what we can do is to estimate how this will evolve. So on average, will there be more people per household or less people per household than today? And to do that, we could do many different things. Let me go down to yes, to this part. We could just number of person per household, see how it has evolved over the last year and apply the same evolution rate to the future. Or we can look at a relation between in other countries or in similar countries or in the past, what kind of relation does it exist between the number of people per household and the household income? And this is what we've just done here with putting all the dots on a function on a chart and revealing what the function is. So how y, which is household occupancy, can be expressed as a function of x, which is GDP per capita, and Excel itself will give us a formula and defining what the parameters are, A, B, C. We can project where the household occupancy will be when GDP per capita will be at a certain level. So this is what was presented by Tim, and you will be able to enter more into the detail of such calculation. So we can do that for dwelling occupancy. We can also do that for AC units per household. So again, what we've done here is to look for a relation between AC units per household and GDP per capita. During the presentation, it was discussed that there can be an S curve if we aggregate all the available data. What we have found here is more of a line, also a linear relation between number of air conditioner in each household and income of the household or GDP per capita. So we can use this formula to project the evolution of number of AC units per household, given that we know how the GDP per capita is supposed to evolve. So these were the two econometric approaches that we have taken to make projections on future number of AC units per household and future number of people per household. Given that we have projections on number of households, we can deduct we have predictions on number of people in the country. So we can deduct how many households there would be and then how many AC units we would expect to see in the country. And bottom line is that according to our calculation, we expect a doubling from 1.5 million air conditioners in the country to 2.7 by the end of the decade. This was just to understand what the need for service can be based on the fleet of equipment. Now we need to understand more what the service demand intensity is. So how much do we want to use an AC unit? What the quantity of service we want to get per appliance? We were given historical data. How would this evolve in the future? Here, we took a very quick step that was to calculate what is the or to get the historical growth rate and to apply it to the future. And based on that, we can deduct what the total service demand will be, because we know how much service we want from one AC unit, and we know how many AC units there will be in the country. So that's a very important first step to be able to project how total service demand based on demographic projections, based on economic evolution, and based on our calculation with econometric approaches, give us as future parameters under this total service demand. So we know how much electricity is needed or is required by those appliances. Now the question is, what's the efficiency of the devices. And again, we were given historical data. And the question is how to project that. And we were also given the prevalence of each technology. So to make it simple, technology 1 may be old AC units, whereas technology 2 would be more modern, and technology 3 super modern, super efficient AC units, which are not yet in the country now because their market share is at 0. But in the future, we could have a policy which targets to deploy more those technologies, for example, by incentivizing them or by subsidizing those highly efficient technologies, or by asking, for example, all public buildings like administration, ministries, schools, etc., to resort to this kind of advanced technologies rather than others. So we are determining this target for prevalence of the technology, and we can deduct what will be the efficiency relative to each technology, taking again all those assumptions. And once we know the average efficiency of the fleet of all those devices, and we know the service demanded, we can deduct what is the total electricity demand in the country. And here again, we see more than a doubling of electricity demand. Once this exercise is done, as always, what's interesting is to make sensitivities analysis to see how the different parameters we defined could impact our end result. And here, sorry, on the right part of the screen, you would have some charts where you would see how service demand evolves, how the efficiency of the fleet of the global all the equipments in the country evolve, and our main output and the main answer to this modeling exercise, which is how much electricity will be demanded in the future by households to meet their cooling needs. We can see this blue line, how this evolve. And then what we can change is, for example, what if total demand intensity increases at an annual pace of 4% instead of 3.5, which means what if households want to use even more their AC units, for example, because the average temperature is higher, or because comfort pushes them to use more of those appliances. So of course, if we have more demand for service, that will entail an increase in total electricity demand. But at the same time, if we try to push more for more efficient technologies, like technology number 3, which has best performances, if we say that we want this technology to reach 20% market share by 2030 rather than 7.5, we can see that we come back to a similar level of electricity demand than what we had before changing the first parameter. So you can see different sensitivities here under our base case, under what if there is higher demand, and what if there is higher demand but we use very efficient technologies. So I'm stopping here for the Excel exercise, and now I'm happy to answer any question on the exercise, on the presentation. And of course, we'll send you the corrections of the Excel so you can take more time to look into, and feel free to send us any question per email, of course. And if you want to do yourself the calculation and check versus what we have, you're also most welcome.
Good morning, everyone.
Hello, Ariane. Thanks a lot for joining us. We just closed the exercise, so we are now able to take questions from our participants from Ghana.
Any questions are welcome.
So you have the Q&A box, or you can directly raise your hand. These can be questions or comments, or sharing any feedback you have on what you have seen. Most welcome. Any information you want to share on the specific context of Ghana, most welcome as well. We've discussed a lot energy efficiency in this exercise for appliances, but we're also aware that Ghana is pushing a lot for energy efficiency in general, in different topics, different sectors. So any experience you want to share, I would be very happy to hear you.
Indeed, it's really important to put in place this kind of policies to help to manage the energy demand. Otherwise, I can briefly, while waiting for some questions, I can briefly explain you what we're doing at the moment for a new report that will be released very soon, in about 10 days normally. So it's called the NZD reports. So the main goal of this report is to produce pathways to reach net zero carbon emissions target by 2050. So it's a comprehensive pathways for all sectors, and we want, of course, to reach this target at the world level, but it relies, of course, on the WEM model with detailed analysis by regions. So this pathway, of course, still includes a target of universal access by 2030 for clean cooking. And we increase the ambitions of different policies in order to decarbonize the energy system. So we increase renewables production, we increase the efficiency of numerous technologies. We deploy, for instance, more electric vehicles, more heat pumps. We rely also on CCUS, for instance. But if I go back maybe briefly on buildings, as I am working mostly on buildings part of the model. So for buildings, we said that for this report that we need that all buildings need to be zero carbon ready by 2050. So it means that we have to increase the retrofit rates of existing buildings. So we, of course, an improvement of the envelope for these existing buildings, and also for the new buildings. The buildings code become more stringent. So it helps us to manage to lower in some part the energy demand for heating and for cooling. Paired with that, of course, we also have more efficient air conditioners. So this is a really important step to measures to help lower the energy demand and thus lower the emissions associated to the buildings energy sector. So for cooling, for instance, we have more efficient AC, but we also have more efficient buildings envelope that help to reduce the demand. So we assume that, for instance, that an improvement of the envelope can help to reduce demand by 30 to 50%, for instance. And yeah, lastly, for appliances and lighting, we also assume that all appliances become more efficient, and that they are their efficiency level is comparable to the best available technologies today.
Thank you, Ayan, for sharing this perspective on this forthcoming work. We will have opportunity to discuss more the findings of these net zero report and implication for Africa in the coming weeks as soon as it's out. So we received one question, Ayan, and I might share the slide which relates to that. Which is
Yes,
which is about how to make one proxy variable. I think Tim in his presentation discussed how to do discriminant criterion based on several information like income plus urbanization plus level of electricity access. I don't know if you can come back to this type of exercise.
Yeah.
And I'm
sure. So
yeah, I think I'm sharing the slide.
Okay. So I'm not sure to completely understand the question, but please ask more details if I'm not. I did not reply fully to this question. So the first step is to choose the best proxy. So for instance, here you have the refrigerator ownership with respect to different proxies. So for instance, we will say that the refrigerator ownership, the best proxy to assess this variable is to use GNI per capita. Sometimes we also, so the first step is to try to use different proxies to see which proxy is the best to use. So for instance, if you trace the units per household according to, I don't know, the floor space, it will not give you anything relevant. And once you have the relationship between the two variables, you try to estimate the best curve that make the links between the two variables, and then at the end you can compute the evolution. You can assess the evolution of the variables you're looking at.
Thanks, Ariane. And maybe to illustrate also with the presentation and the Excel exercise, you might remember from this slide that when first looking at air conditioner as a function of income, it was not clear enough what the relation was, but then with adding information on the weather, and are we looking at countries with very warm climate and then a high need for cooling or not, this helps make some clear functions and curves. And also in the Excel illustration, and I'm trying to share my screen at the same time. Yeah, what we saw when doing this kind of analysis is that first we have just made our relation, putting just on a figure all the dots we had based on historical data to see if there is a relation between, in that case, AC units per household and income. And then we have added a trend line. So this is something we do manually on Excel. Add a trend line, and then you can choose if it's linear, logarithmic. So you can explore to find the curve that will stick the most to your to all your points. And for this one, it's also something we have been looking for. It was a bit more complex, so a trend line was not very relevant because it's not very linear. So we could look for something logarithmic or polynomial, just to explore and step by step and in an iterative process, look if we can find some strong correlation that we will then be able to use to look at the future values.
Exactly. And when you're looking for the best curve that fits to your variables, you try to minimize the error between the estimation of, for instance, in this case, a polynomial curve and your actual values that you have for historical values, for instance.
And technically, Excel is really good at helping you find the best trend line, but also at defining those variables. So in the handbook, we send you a link to the solver functionality of Excel. But basically, you can ask Excel to find what the parameters are, so A, B, C, so that you minimize the error, or so that your line sticks as much as possible to the dots you have based on your historical data.
Exactly. And please don't hesitate to come back to us if you have questions about this Excel.
Okay. We can still wait 1 minute to see if more questions are coming.
Of course. Maybe one additional comment about the NZD report that I didn't mention earlier is that we included this year behavioral analysis. So this helps also to reduce the CO2 emissions and the energy demand. And so, for instance, for buildings, it implies, for instance, an adaptation of indoor temperature settings. So for cooling, for instance, we say that the temperature reference is not 25, but it will be lowered around 22, for instance. So this kind of measures help also to reduce the energy demand and thus the CO2 emissions. And of course, in different sectors, there are other measures. So for instance, in transport, we have a reduction of flights. So people fly less. And the idea behind the analysis is not to prevent people from accessing to service demand. The service demand is still growing, but it's really how consumers can adapt a little bit their behavior in order to help to reduce the energy demand.
Yeah, thank you, Ariane. Very interesting to highlight this. I think we could have done a quick survey on for all of you participants. I assume you are sitting in some office or in your home in Accra or somewhere else, and we could have asked what the indoor temperature and how much you're using your air conditioner, and then trying to estimate the impact on final energy demand if you would accept to cool a bit less your place, and the same applies in northern countries for heating, as Ariane highlighted. What if households agree to heat a bit less during winter their houses? What will be the overall impact on energy systems? So next time, please raise the temperature you're cooling your office or your room. That would be an interesting poll.
It will be indeed really interesting to see a real-time impact.
Okay, so I'd like to thank you very much, Ariane, for your time. Thanks to you and team for having presented this session on energy modeling for the building sector.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks a lot, Arnaud, and thanks to all the participants.
And so we will keep our journey to understanding more how energy modeling works with a new session tomorrow. So same time, 9 a.m. Accra time, to now discuss the power sector. So today we've taken building as an illustration of one end-use sector and to understand how energy demand for different fuels stem from this sector. Tomorrow we will look more at transformation processes, and once we know this need for electricity in building, in industry, or even in transport, How do we ensure that the power system can provide this electricity, and where does that come from? And also, how do we increasingly integrate renewable energy, which are expected to grow very fast, especially in Africa, to balance those power sector. So it will be a new interesting session. Hope you will have a bit more questions. Feel free to prepare them in advance so that we can have more interactions in the session. So thank you very
Thanks a
much.
lot.
Have a good day all.
Bye.